this country is at a fulcrum point. You know, the baby boomers, the largest generation until the millennials came along, but certainly the wealthiest and most powerful are dying out. And by the end of the decade, beginning of the next decade, they're not going to be with us anymore. We're going to have a severe demographic issue in this country. You know, we will not be probably as wealthy as we were in the 20th century.
Today, I'm joined with Brandon Weichert. He's the founder of the Weichert Report, an online journal of geopolitics. He's a geopolitical analyst and the author of Winning Space: How America Remains a Superpower, and The Shadow War: Iran's Quest for Supremacy. He's an energy analyst and a former congressional staffer. He contributes to the Washington Times and provides a wealth of information about the United States and its relationships abroad. Now, he's an expert on geopolitics. I can't wait to get into it. There's so much going on. You just got back from DC. What a time to be an American. Tell me, what was that trip like?
Well, I was participating. I was one of the lead participants in the Heritage Foundation's election integrity project that they did with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And I was playing, we didn't call it a war game, but it was basically what it was. It was an election simulation to see what are some of the weaknesses in our election system, what might foreign actors be trying to exploit in terms of those weaknesses, and how do we secure our elections from future meddling. And so I did the China team, and basically, I initiated a conflict over Taiwan around Labor Day, and you know, we tried to keep it as realistic as possible, but they did also, you know, tell us, you know, we can have some wiggle room, and so there were two simultaneous games going on. I was in the second game. I can tell your audience that if you are expecting to have a calm, predictable election cycle, you're already seeing it right now in the United States. Do not anticipate that.
So much of what we do at Pinnacle is investing, commodities, hard assets, things like that. Many of these are
the things I'm interested in as well.
Yeah, well, that's perfect, because I mean, most of these things are priced in US dollars. And when the US dollar goes down, you know, gold, silver, they go up. When you look at the US globally, in terms of our power, in terms of the US power and influence, would you say that it's fading? How fast is it fading? Do you think we're going to be able to maintain the global world reserve currency? How far into the future? When you look at some of the threats on the horizon, do you see anything that could destabilize that in the next 5 to 10 years?
So my closing remarks, and I don't know if I might have not sent it to you. I thought I did. The closing remarks I gave at Heritage actually had nothing to do with election integrity. They had to do with my take on exactly what you're talking about, which is the threat to the US dollar. Nobody in DC is talking about this. The couple times it comes up, you get laughed out of the room. Everybody still thinks it's 1996. And I'm here to tell your audience that the US dollar is about to die as the global reserve currency. And so the question now is, what replaces it? Now, you mentioned gold and you mentioned some of these other commodities. I'm looking a lot at crypto as well. I really think, and the number one threat to the US dollar, or rather the way that it is being exploited, this weakness of the US dollar, is being exploited through the BRICS alliance, which has basically been controlled or co-opted by China and to a lesser degree Russia. And so we talk a lot about containment, and we talk a lot about, you know, encircling the enemy in a geopolitical standpoint. And I'm here to tell you that actually what we need to be talking about is how one encircles or contains their enemy at the geoeconomic level. And in my opinion, China, for the last 10 years, has been playing this game far better than the United States. The United States is not even on the field. And now we are waking up to a world in which China is leading the BRICS countries with Russia in a geoeconomic encirclement of the United States. So what we did to the Soviet Union in the Cold War, with military, with NATO, and with, some of these other things. The Chinese and Russians have figured out you're not going to beat the Americans in a military fight. You're going to beat them by destroying their dollar. You destroy the dollars. Now, obviously, there are other currencies in the world. I know this, but the primary reserve currency of the world remains the dollar, and it's the first among equals. Once that is gone, our governments, and I say this as somebody, a recovering Hill staffer, once that is gone, the U.S. government can no longer print and spend money with wanton abandon. Now, maybe in the long run, that actually ends up making us more fiscally responsible. But in the near term, it's going to cause so much chaos at home, and it's going to cause so much destabilization abroad that you will be looking at the death of a superpower without ever firing a shot. And that is the dream of China and Russia. And they just might get there, especially given who we have in office.
China has its own problems. Russia has its own problems. You see the Saudis, last month basically saying they're open to not taking USD for payment.
Right.
Huge. What needs to happen? I mean, India, obviously huge. Which economy, which countries need to, coalesce and join China, join this BRIC alliance that would actually see, China has its own, like we have the SWIFT system. They have their own system. Right. I think it's SIPS or something, right? So, you're still not seeing a ton of transactions. Like the dollar is still king. What is that domino?
Right. So, there's the old Lawrence of Arabia, and then it was also used, I think, in that Ridley Scott movie, Prometheus. Big things have small beginnings. Yeah. Right now, yes, the dollar remains the primary reserve currency, but that's inertia. And I think right now, the key question is who's going to take over in the United States and what is their spending policies going to be? Are they going to continue to destroy the currency, or are they going to do something to shore up our economic house? Yeah. If we can get the right person in office that can slow down the spending, shore up our economic productivity, I think we might be able to avoid the death of the dollar. But as it stands right now, we are on the trajectory very soon of the dollar dying. Yeah. And so, you're right. Yes, there have been not a lot of moves beyond sort of these announcements saying that we're going off the dollar. But you just recently, you had China and Russia announce that they were going to start using crypto as the alternative in these sort of local transactions with other BRICS members. This is a baby step, but it is an important step. And, it has a snowball effect if we're not careful, because right now the rest of it's global north versus global south. And the global north team includes the United States, lost one of our primary players, Russia. We pushed them into the global south team. And so now, and Russia's a commodity superpower. And so now what we're looking at is we're playing for the hearts and minds and wallets of the global south, the developing world, and we are at a significant disadvantage. And so, it's going to take a while, but the Chinese and the Russians are coordinating with the BRICS, and they are making substantial movements toward ultimately dethroning the dollar, which then will basically incapacitate our economy for a protracted period of time. And that is the real threat. It's not a near-term threat. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but there have been decisive steps, however small, now toward dethroning the dollar. And it really is also going to be contingent on how this election plays out. And the policies of the current administration, I would argue, have significantly exacerbated these bad trends working against the dollar and helping the kind of global south team rise. If you can get a different president, maybe they make different moves. Maybe they do different deals. Maybe they do different things than what are being done now. And that kind of stays the executioner's hand. But right now, things are looking good for the dollar in the long run.
Yeah. Listen, like you can read, This Time is Different. Great book, documents the last 200, banking, currency crises all across the world. Once you go through that 100% debt to GDP, you got a problem. And the U.S. is at about, the U.S. is at about 125. And, the Congressional Budget Office, which
it's not stopping.
It's not stopping. And I'm afraid we both know it's not going to stop under Trump. It may be less. It's not going to be
No.
$3 trillion deficits or $4 trillion under Biden, but it's still probably going to be 2. The Congressional Budget Office, which is bipartisan, has said they're projecting $2 trillion deficits annually through to 2033. So the spending is not going to stop. There's only one way out, and that's devaluation. There is going to be prolonged massive inflation in the United States. And if you're not prepared for that, you are going to get wiped out, as people are getting wiped out. We're seeing it in real time. So the middle class continues to get hollowed out. That's why Trump is doing so well in the polls. That's why Biden isn't. But the solution to this obviously is to stay diversified, protect yourself with hard assets and whatnot. But the United States is that sort of, they're going to try to grow their way out of this by if Trump gets in, slashing taxes and cutting regulation as he did before. And I think you're going to get a nice bump there. But I think long-term, 5-10 years, the only way out is a massive devaluation of the dollar, bring that debt to GDP ratio down. You know what I mean? So even though the economy's flat, we're still posting 5%, 7% GDP growth, and it's all inflation. And then you just, you get that GDP, debt to GDP ratio down, and then all of a sudden they're financeable again and the game keeps going.
Right. And and you mentioned growing your way out of this. I do think that Trump's insistence on real things in the economy, bringing back industry, bringing back manufacturing, I actually think in the long run that could help us to grow out of some of these problems. But the real issue is the spending. And I have a very disturbing bit of information. It sounds like Peter Navarro, who was Trump's economic advisor in the first term, he right now has Trump's ear and has convinced Trump, it sounds like, to do a MAGA New Deal is what they're calling it. And basically expanding the administrative state, along Trumpian lines, and then basically, spending even more money on trying to become like FDR. And that scares the heck out of me, because that is the absolute wrong direction we should be going in. And so you're right. Trump was famously self-described as the king of debt.
Yep.
And he governed that way. And, and he's not interested in restraining anything. I mean, remember his big push in 2016 was, I'm the only Republican who won't cut your Social Security. I just want to manage it better.
Yeah.
And we know that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, as well as the defense budget, are the 4 biggest line items that we have outside of the debt repayment.
Yeah, the interest on the debt has now,
a huge problem.
It is a huge problem. And we actually dubbed Trump the inflation president, either right before he got in 2016 or right after. Now,
he really was. I mean, and then COVID really,
COVID exacerbated
strong-arming power.
Yeah. The real inflation didn't show up till 21, till he sort of got out, but he was a big part of that with the spending.
He was, but to be fair, around the end of his first term, after he reopened, the economy did start to bounce back.
Oh yeah.
The problem now though is the Biden administration, under the auspices, and I'm a big supporter of infrastructure, but not the way the Biden administration did it. The way under the auspices of Build Back Better, the Biden administration spent something like, I think, like $2.3 trillion of money we didn't have on things that yet to bear any fruit whatsoever. And so that actually exploded the deficit even more than Trump's COVID spending. And when you combine that with Trump's COVID spending, you have the mother of all storms, which then makes it possible for China and Russia and BRICS to kind of step in and say, okay, now is when we can challenge the US dollar's primacy. And I want to add one more thing. I want to, from the sort of the diplomatic or geopolitical angle, Saudi Arabia would have, and that was really sort of the big kicker for this move away from the dollar. Saudi Arabia would have never done what they did had it not been for the diplomatic policy of the Biden administration. I talk a lot about this in my book, The Shadow War, Iran's Quest for Supremacy. Joe Biden and the Democratic Party have been at war with Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia, for years. They believe he's a human rights violator. He is. They don't like the fact that he's not really a good Democrat with a lowercase d. He's not. But ultimately, you've got to dance with the ones who brung you. And Saudi Arabia, as it is currently led, should be a key partner of ours. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has basically turned Saudi Arabia against us. And on top of that, Saudi Arabia now does more business with the Asian countries in terms of oil. And also, China is heavily investing in Silicon Wadi, which is their version of Silicon Valley, which is what Mohammed bin Salman hopes will be the key driver of moving Saudi Arabia away from an oil only economy into a new age modern economy. All of those things, and then also the fact that the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, wants to do the nuclear deal with Iran, which is a sworn enemy of Saudi Arabia. And so all of those things congealed together to basically ensure that Saudi Arabia's leadership is looking to stab America in the back because of our policies under the Biden administration. I argue, had Trump gotten a second term, none of what we saw happening in terms of Saudi Arabia going off the petrodollar and things like that, or trading on other currencies, none of that would have happened. We would not have seen it. This is exclusively because Mohammed bin Salman and Joe Biden just don't like each other. And so this is now going to have very long-term negative consequences for a very short-term problem.
Remember the famous fist pump on one of his trips over there?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That was through gritted teeth. I can assure you.
Yeah. No, there's no love lost there. When you look at the dollar, and I mean, this is obviously impossible to predict, but looking at the U.S. dollar index after the 2008 financial crisis, you saw it sort of roll over as the spending began and all this, deficit spending started in 2009, 2010. The U.S. dollar started to fall. Okay, it started to fall, it collapsed. It was down around the low 70s. Gold hit then an all-time high, just above 1900. Flash forward to today, the U.S. dollar index is strong. It's still 103, 104. It's well above 100. Gold is at, an all-time high, bumping up almost to 2,500. What takes the U.S. dollar down below 100 to 90 to 80 to 70? Like it's the old story, right? Like the cleanest shirt in the dirty bin, right? So, I mean, what is going to, expedite that fall? Is it going to be obviously, like a sound alternative, a BRICS currency backed by gold or crypto or something else? That alternative is going to have to emerge.
That's the big one. I think that's the big one.
Okay.
I think right now what you see is if we're talking about a military engagement, this is the probing phase. In terms of geoeconomic engagement, this is China probing America's weaknesses economically. And so they are probing right now, trying to figure out what would be the most believable alternative. And that's why I said I would keep an eye on these crypto things that they're talking about doing in BRICS, because the one thing we know, and this gets back to policy, and I don't want to make this partisan or anything, but the fact of the matter is, why is Russia even helping China do this? Well, it's because we did take the Russian sovereign funds. We annexed that as part of the sanctions package against Russia for invading Ukraine. Well, the Russians are not the only ones who have a lot of money, rely on America to hold on to their money. And now the rest of the world is looking around going, particularly these developing countries, going, well, if they're going to do that to nuclear armed Russia, there's nothing stopping them from doing that to tiny us. What happens when the regime change machine turns on us and says, oh, well, we have to go in favor of democracy. And so this is, part of the reason this movement's even happening, this movement against the dollar, and that they're looking at things like crypto, is because crypto offsets that ability of a central government like the U.S. government from going after sovereign wealth funds and things like that. And so here again, we have a short-term policy in Washington really having long-term significant damage to us economically. None of this would be happening had we A, avoided getting involved with the Ukraine war, and B, had we just said, you know what, some things are not worth risking, like the dominance of the dollar. But here we are throwing caution to the wind for nothing. It doesn't even make sense why we're doing it. And now Russia will never trust us again. And the rest of the developing world is following Russia's lead because they're worried the same could happen to them.
Yeah, it was a very dangerous precedence to set. There's no question about that.
It was insane.
Yeah,
I have a book coming. I have a book coming out in October called A Disaster of Our Own Making, How We Lost Ukraine. And while it's not entirely about what we're talking about now, I do mention it because so much about the last few years have been completely self-inflicted. It's truly a disaster of our own making. And, it really is amazing how, leadership counts, and the proclivities of individual leaders are still very important for determining how things will shake out historically. Yeah. And so the dollar is being, probed for weaknesses, and there are a lot of weaknesses. BRICS is the lead challenger to it via China and Russia.
Yeah. When you say crypto, are you talking about central bank digital currencies? Are you talking about Bitcoin? What are you talking about?
Things like Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I'm talking about things like Bitcoin. That's what the BRICS are talking about. They're not talking about, I know that China's developing their own central banking digital currency, and I know the Fed is interested in that as well. I've spoken about that before with Heritage and whatnot. Yeah. But from what I understand, and maybe I misread it, but from what I understand, the China and Russia and BRICS are looking at sort of like Bitcoin type, where it's protected, where it can't be, penetrated or permeated by, the Americans.
Yeah.
And that is a key development. And actually, by the way, in general, that's great. Like in terms of as somebody who is worried about freedom and whatnot, in terms of my money and how it can be used against me, the idea of Bitcoin is great. Yeah. I just, I don't know how useful it is at a large scale, which is why I say it remains to be seen, how the BRICS challenge shakes out. And so, and obviously, a more conventional challenge would be using conventional commodities like gold and silver and things like that. And we know that China and Russia have some of the largest reserves of gold in the world, that they've, China in particular, I think for the last 15 years has been buying up as much as possible. And so obviously they are aware of the vulnerability of relying on King Dollar.
Yeah, they're the largest producer of gold in the world and have been for many years. And they're also the largest buyer of gold. And
and I think Russia's right behind them too.
Let's talk I just want to touch on the potential for a hot war. I mean, tensions do seem to be escalating. You've been calling, for the eventual outbreak of World War III for years now. We've had guests on that have basically said, look, until the U.S. loses some kind of military war, be it naval, air, something, the dollar will remain the king and it won't be dethroned. What are your thoughts on that? And how close do you think we are to an actual...
Well, I want to clarify. I've been talking about World War III. I've not been advocating for it, though.
Big difference. You've been warning that the potential for it to happen is getting
warning about it
higher.
Right. For those of those people online who hate me, in which there are as many people who hate me, that I don't want them to think that I'm, warmongering. But no, I do think that, and again, this is part of it is because of just bad leadership. Another part of it is just trends working against America. This country is at a fulcrum point. The baby boomers, the largest generation until the millennials came along, but certainly the wealthiest and most powerful are dying out. And by the end of the decade, beginning of the next decade, they're not going to be with us anymore. We're going to have a severe demographic issue in this country. We will not be probably as wealthy as we were in the 20th century. It's just the way things are. And the wealth probably won't be very well distributed or evenly distributed. So you've got a lot of problems in this country, and you have this fight between tyranny or authoritarianism and freedom. And, what is it to be an American? So you have a lot of issues going on all at once. And then globally, you have the rise of the others. You have the rise of China. You have the return of Russia. You have even India, which is a relatively friendly country, but it is, rising and has its own agenda. And America and Americans have not had to live in a multipolar environment in decades. The last and a multipolar environment where we're not necessarily the most comprehensively dominant. I mean, the
Yeah.
last time that existed was World War One,
Yeah.
where we were in a multipolar environment that was not conducive to us. And so this is, we have to learn to rebuild those muscles, if you will.
Yeah.
And if we don't, we die. And
Mhm.
so right now, the rest of the world is challenging us because they sense weakness and they sense indecision. And so I have argued that we are not, Neil Ferguson talks about, oh, it's a new Cold War. If we're lucky, it'll be a new Cold War. I think that we're right now in the openings of World War III, and
Mhm.
there's still an off ramp. But if we keep the current elites in power in DC, particularly, we will most assuredly be in a World War III.
You don't think they're willing to let the dollar go peacefully?
Who is they? You mean our elites?
Our elites in the United States.
They don't even know it's happening. They don't even know it's happening. So when I made that statement at Heritage, and you can find it on my Twitter feed at We the Brandon,
Okay.
and I'll repost it so everybody can kind of see it at the top of the page.
Mm-hmm.
When I made that statement at Heritage, the gentleman on the panel with me, who is younger than me, was nodding in agreement because he, of course, anybody who's a millennial or younger understands this is the truth. But the boomer audience looking at me, they looked at me like I had five heads. And that's a relatively conservative, forward-leaning, reality-based group. And then you talk to my friends at the Atlantic Council, and they literally laugh me out of the room. They don't even want to talk to me anymore because they think I'm crazy.
This was your speech on how the dollar will die, basically.
Well, that was at my closing remarks for the Election Integrity Project. They had asked me to extrapolate, and this was sort of where I went. I didn't even talk about election integrity at that point.
Right.
But when I go up to DC, I have friends at the Atlantic Council, which is sort of like the premier organization of elite thinking.
Mm-hmm.
They won't even invite me up there anymore to the Atlantic Council because they think I'm crazy. But because these people, these elites, notably the political side, they don't understand. They do not understand, and they don't want to understand because it's too much rocking of the boat. Now, some of the guys I talk to in the finance sector, they get it. But there's still a lot of financial elites also who are sort of, following the political elite leadership and saying, oh, well, it's, but this is different from what happened before. And I think the rest of the world, especially with our weak leadership, the rest of the world is looking at America going, we don't want to be led by you anymore. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to do things to challenge you. And we're willing to go to war, particularly Russia and China are, and Iran. We're willing to go to war to completely upend your perfect little system. And you're seeing the contours of that happening. And by the way, your audience should be watching very closely this situation between Venezuela and Guyana. That Russian flotilla that is parked 90 miles south of me in Cuba, they are not there just to, flip the bird to the United States. They are there because I think they know their buddy Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, is getting ready to go into oil-rich Guyana and reclaim it. And that naval force is there to basically prevent the U.S. Navy, which will be the primary response mechanism, prevent the U.S. Navy from getting in close to Venezuela or Guyana and from deploying forces there to protect Guyana, which we are in an alliance with. And so that is another hot spot to watch out for. And that's going to destabilize our southern border because it's going to create a refugee flow through the Darien Gap all the way up to the broken border. That's a key flashpoint to watch out for beyond what we're already seeing. And then, of course, there's China and Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And I am convinced, as is Eric Prince, I am convinced that this fall you very well may see, if not an invasion of Taiwan, a true blockade of Taiwan by China's Navy, and they're just going to strangle them.
Fascinating about Guyana. We did a whole podcast on the banana wars in Nicaragua and the CIA's involvement down there.
Yeah.
And all the different,
And of course, as you know, there's a lot of resources down there.
You better believe it, man. Yeah, no, I spent a week down in Nicaragua to some gold mines. It was incredible, extremely resource rich. But yeah, wow. Fascinating.
And if you look at Africa, what's going on in Africa, right? I mean, there's a reason that the Wagner Group is crawling all over the region. There's a reason that China is all over the region.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just resources. My first book was called Winning Space: How America Remains a Superpower. I was part of the Space Force thing. I was one of my big jobs was consulting with the Trump team on how do we get this thing going. Space Force, of course, now it's one big joke, but it wasn't when it was conceived. What we're looking at and what I've been watching is China is trying to get real estate in Africa as well as South America, and they do have it in South America, but they're trying to get it in Africa to build spaceports. And also they're trying to get the Atlantic coast of in order to build naval bases so they can project power better into the Atlantic and specifically the Caribbean Sea and our backyard. That is where this is going. And so it's not just about resources, it's also about strategic land.
You can see the fighting between the DRC and Rwanda over the gold and the cobalt and all that stuff that's been going on down there for years and years.
And China's behind it. So is Russia.
Yeah.
Right.
But there were
and Russia, just kicked us out of Niger.
Yeah, and the French too, and they've got some big problems now because some of the French are 100% reliant on nuclear. But I think 70% of their electricity comes from nuclear energy, and they get all their uranium, or 26% of it, or something like that, from Niger.
So think about this. You talk about uranium. Some of the world's largest uranium deposits in places like Venezuela and Colombia. And we've lost Colombia to the left. It's part of that pink tide.
Yeah.
And they are vociferously anti-American now. And they used to be like our little brother down there. Colombia is a wonderful place. And Venezuela also has a large amount of uranium it's sitting on. And they've been sharing that with the Iranians for years. That was part of the whole Aero terror thing that, the Iran, Damascus, or the Tehran, Damascus, Caracas flight line. They used to have these, they still do these flights between those three cities that were diplomatic flights, but actually were moving, things like illicit uranium as well as IRGC members to and from South America. And so, we are losing some of the most important regions of the world to the Russians and the Chinese. And now the Russians and the Chinese are amplifying their power geoeconomically via BRICS. And yet we are completely blinkered by this. And, you mentioned what would World War III look like, losing a war. First of all, we've already lost multiple wars. We've lost Afghanistan. We lost Iraq. We lost Libya. We've lost Syria. I mean, I know these aren't technically wars, but come on, they're wars. And now and we're about to lose Ukraine. And now if China decides to go into Taiwan, and I'm a national security analyst over at the National Interest, and I write extensively on the 3 more pieces coming out this week on this. When and if China decides to pull the trigger, especially if it's soon, Taiwan's going to get rolled. They're done. It's there. And United States, Biden said he would defend Taiwan. Trump is questioning that right now. But if Biden is in charge and he does follow through on his threat, the United States project power close to regions that are protected in Asia by what's known as A2AD. That's anti-access area denial. Okay, anti-ship missiles, so think of the missiles that the Houthis are using that are very effective at keeping U.S. power relatively back from where they want to defend. Well, the Chinese have these systems in abundance, and they're far more complex. They can reach out as far as 1,100 kilometers from their bases in those man-made islands in the South China Sea and along China's coast. The U.S. Navy is going to be the tip of the spear responding to any Chinese provocation against Taiwan. The U.S. Navy's primary platform for power projection presently is the aircraft carrier. Well, the aircraft carrier, how fast it may go, which is about 35 miles an hour at sea, no matter how maneuverable it may be, and our aircraft carriers are actually very maneuverable, they are still sitting ducks for these systems. The Chinese, they have produced A2AD systems like sausage. They're cheap. They're very sophisticated for being so cheap and highly accurate. And now they've married this with very sophisticated sensor capabilities at every layer. And also they've now merged with hypersonic capabilities, and which we don't have any active defense against. So the primary platforms that we would use to protect from a Chinese invasion of Taiwan will be, if not destroyed, which would be a huge blow for the United States military. But if they're not destroyed, they will certainly be kept over the horizon. And then what do we do? How do we fight China? And that's all they need to do, is to basically keep us back long enough to change conditions on the ground in Taiwan. And that's what the plan is. That's Beijing's big play. And then they're going to kind of complicate our lives by going after our satellites. They'll hit us. You've seen this with Volt Typhoon right now. They're going to hit us in the cyber domain. They're going to hit us across the electromagnetic spectrum. They're going to try to complicate life for us as much as possible so that we restrain in the face of their aggression. And then they're going to be able to take Taiwan, and then they're going to be able to tell the world, we beat the Americans. And the global South is going to take note of that. And it won't just be Saudi Arabia going off the dollar. It's going to be most of the rest of the world, because we will look like we are a defeated power.
Interesting. So instead of the U.S., the spending is one thing, the deficit spending and the debt and all that, but you think it could come just with the success, either like Russia's success in Ukraine, China's success in Taiwan, could show the South, hey, there's a new king in town. The U.S. seems to have kind of like lost its teeth over the last, 10, 20 years, even in, in Africa, different mining companies, things get a little bit bumpy, they're out of there. Whereas China has been willing to go places that the U.S. just hasn't, and do things that the U.S. hasn't been willing to do. And that in the 70s or 80s,
that's why we lost the oil in Iraq. The oil companies in America, this idea that we went to war for oil, U.S. oil companies are the most risk-averse, conglomerates in the world.
But it didn't
the
used
Chinese
to be.
And the Russians
following a military success. Not
one particular thing, but it's a knock-on effect. So you're already seeing, I spend probably the majority of my time, even though I am, trained and I work as a geopolitical analyst, I'm really a writer. That's what I love to do. I have multiple books out. I write everywhere. So I study language. I study propaganda. I study what our enemies say, what our government says, and I try to figure out, well, what are they really trying to say? And so obviously before any action, there's usually the formulation of thought, which comes in the form of words. And you're already seeing the narrative being shaped by China and Russia right now, that they are the defenders of the global South from the dirty, crazy imperialists of the global North, notably the United States. You've been seeing that narrative going back to the Cold War, but it's really been refined now. And a lot of people now are believing it, because to the rest of the world, we look crazy and stupid. And we look like we have blown our wallet open. We just look terrible. And the last straw to break for our image as being the true superpower will be if we are defeated in a great power war. And the Russia thing, so Russia is getting ready to roll all over Ukraine. And that's what my next book is about, coming out in October.
Summarize that for us. Summarize, Brandon. What do the next 6 to 12 months look like in Ukraine?
So for the Ukraine, if they do not negotiate like now, there's no amount of money we could give them, no amount of old F-16s, no amount of, Abrams tanks, which they didn't even know what to do with when we gave it to them, was a waste. There's nothing we could do militarily for them that will stop the Russians from attriting the Ukrainians and then just waltzing in as they see fit, which is what the Russian way of war traditionally is. Traditionally, the Russian way of war, it's not like our way of war. It is bloody, it is brutal, it is high body counts, but it's effective. They're going to win just by bleeding the enemy dry, especially a smaller enemy like Ukraine. So my prediction is Ukraine is lost unless they start negotiating, which Putin still has made it out like he's willing to negotiate. Unless a real negotiation takes place now, then not only will Russia keep eastern Ukraine and Crimea, which is already a done deal. No matter what happens, he's keeping those areas. So anybody thinking otherwise is insane. The question is he going to take the rest of the country? I don't actually believe he really wants to at this point. I think he'll do it if he thinks he can't neutralize the perceived threat. What is the perceived threat? NATO expansion into Ukraine. That has always been what this has been his problem with. It's not about, reclaiming old Soviet territories. It's really about defensive perimeters. And it's the old Russian concern of defensive perimeter. And it's in particular, if you look at the way the Russian military is arrayed today, it is about plugging gaps in their defensive perimeter much more so than it is about projecting power beyond their territory. And so Ukraine's going to lose. It's a question of how badly are they going to lose. Now, in the process, a loss of Ukraine will further delegitimize NATO, which of course is a win for Putin. But it's only this way because NATO became so intimately involved with Ukraine. And it makes no sense for why they did, other than the fact that ultimately the elites running NATO wanted Ukraine in NATO. And in fact, I talk about this in the book. I found all the papers, all the white papers from back in the 90s. Boris Yeltsin called them policy entrepreneurs in DC. But basically, the think tank community got together. And I know one person at Hudson Institute in particular was insane enough to be talking about this in 2005. But basically, think tank community got together in Washington and Brussels and London, and they all wrote these papers and they all came up with these schemes for how they were going to expand NATO to encircle post-Soviet Russia, which was at the time on its knees, and how they were going to basically pressure that desiccated husk of a country into breaking apart even more so that it returns to its medieval era borders. And then the Russian threat will forever be gone because it will not actually be Russia. It'll be 4 or 5 smaller countries that can be better managed and whose resources can be exploited. And that is what Putin knows, or that's what he thinks is still the agenda for NATO. And so he's never going to let up in Ukraine until that threat is neutralized, which means that government is gone. And so, the next 6 to 12 months, there's not going to be a Ukraine left. And then the question is going to be, what does NATO do? Well, NATO is going to look really humiliated, and that's going to be straw 1 breaking. Straw 2 breaking is going to be when China decides to hit Taiwan and the Americans can't fight them. And then that's the end of America's superpower from a military perspective.
Trump has famously said he'll end the war in Ukraine 24 hours.
If Trump does win, I do fundamentally believe that Putin and Zelensky will at that point come to the table, sit at a big, beautiful table. And basically what will happen is Ukraine will be divided. Eastern Ukraine and Crimea will go to the Russians. The Americans will recognize. The big thing here for Putin also is getting the Americans to legally recognize their 2014 annexation of Crimea. And so in exchange for a complete end of hostilities and basically letting Western Ukraine kind of live on as a rump neutral state, that is how this thing is going to play out if we can wait until the new president is sworn in, or if he wins. If Biden or whoever they put, because I don't believe Biden's going to be the nominee, if whoever they put as a Democratic nominee wins, all that goes out the window, and it'll probably just be a march on Ukraine because there's no way that Ukraine's going to be able to hold out indefinitely.
So, Brandon, we've touched on so many things. Of all these threats, where are you putting your money? Which assets are you focusing on? How are you protecting yourself?
Things like commodities, things, things that are real, right? Things that are real, and things that in a contested global environment are actually going to be worth a lot. So, there's the old, my friend Jeffrey came up with this. This is his formulation, and I don't know if he copyrighted it or not, but this is his business model. Is he does a lot of investments. His thing is MDEF: metals, defense, energy, food. And then we always say MDEF plus W, which is water. So those are sort of the areas I would look at for potential risks and also potential gain from a financial perspective. And so those are some of the, baseline things. Food security is a big issue. There's some interesting things to be done and to kind of look at and to study.
For sure.
But in a contested global environment, you're going to want to have real commodities. You're going to want to be invested in that. You're going to want to be looking at those things and things like Bitcoin, and then in terms of understanding sort of the security situation, that MDEF plus W formulation helps a lot, because those are going to be the things you need to fight and win wars. I'd like to just say one thing here. And I really I have to be careful here because I don't want to be labeled as crazy or something. But, you know, the last Civil War started not because of slavery, not because of federal rights versus states' rights. Those were sort of ancillary issues. The real trigger point was the South told the government, we can live with a lot of different types of people as president, but we cannot live with Abraham Lincoln as president. And what happened was the American people elected Abraham Lincoln. That was why Fort Sumter happened. It was over the election of a president that half the country didn't like.
Mm-hmm.
My concern is that whether you, whatever however you support or don't support Trump, if he does win, I am very concerned that there's going to be a civil war in this country. And if that happens, all of the calculations I was talking about, with China and Russia and all that, that goes out the window, because America will be mired in a civil war.
Mm.
And the last civil war, if you understand, it was the election of one man that triggered it. It's important to understand that the election of one man, either the Democrat or the Republican candidate, because Biden is hated by the other half of the country too, or whoever is the nominee. But particularly Trump, because he's such a lightning figure.
Yeah.
You could be witnessing the beginning of a actual second American Civil War. And so, in terms of my travel, I have no desire to go anywhere at that point.
No, I wouldn't think so. Just what? Because he's just been so demonized by the media and everybody that the left will just go crazy.
I've met Trump. I've met Trump. I've talked to Trump. I was at CPAC. I was a speaker on the same day as him. We were all in the speakers gallery together. He's certainly a dynamic figure. He's not like how they describe him in the media. He's certainly, he can be brash, he can be vulgar, he can, all the things that stuff's true. But what you're seeing in the media is a very, very carefully negatively choreographed image of him. And I think if you watch the RNC right now, you see the other side of Trump coming out. He's very emotional. He's
he's
crying
human
at points.
Yeah,
he's human. His grandchildren, lovely grandchildren, are out there. And so what I'm getting at is that your point is correct. And this is the same thing with Lincoln, by the way. Lincoln was vilified in the papers. Even before he became president, Lincoln was hated by business interests because Lincoln was a protectionist. And a lot of the free trade community in the Northeast, even the Northeast, didn't like him, but particularly the South didn't like him because of the cotton trade. They needed cotton trade with Britain and Europe, and Lincoln was a protectionist at heart. In fact, there's a great Harvard Business Review essay from about 10 or 12 years ago. I think it was called Lincolnomics, and it was all about how Lincoln had his economic policy. And this is something nobody really talks about because it's always a civil war with him. But he was a protectionist. He liked tariffs. He sounded very Trumpian in his outlook, obviously a different time. But what I'm getting at is the way they talk about Trump today was actually the way a lot of the elites talked about Lincoln back in the day. And if he was elected, how at least half the country told the other half, we're leaving. And so I could foresee something like that happening if Trump wins again, and in part because of the way he's been caricatured in the media.
And if Biden wins or whoever they put forward?
I would imagine there probably would be some outbursts of violence, sort of like, January 6th, but I don't think it would be anywhere near like what it would be if Trump wins and the other side loses. And in terms of what happens, let's just say Biden or whoever takes over and gets another term, all you're going to see is the exacerbation of these negative trends of decline, where basically our debt's going to just go through the roof. The dollar will definitely be dethroned. The U.S. will find itself encircled by rival countries. We're going to lose our border. It basically sets up, this election sets up how America will behave and exist in the world for the next 50 to 75 years. And if a Democrat wins, just based on their policies, it's going to ensure that America is a declining power on its way out. Now with Trump I'm not saying he's perfect. I've been very critical of him, especially after COVID. But we do know there are a handful of things, and he has a record of having had a decent economy and having been strong on the world stage and having been respected by the people that you need to have respect from, which is our enemies. Actually, we need respect more from our enemies than we do from our friends. And Trump had all of that. And so, and if he can get better personnel this time, because that was his real Achilles heel, if he can get better people this time to actually implement some of his agenda, we might be able to get out of this really bad pickle we find ourselves in.
I tend to agree with you. Brandon, where can people find you? Tell us a little bit about your new book coming out, and where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, so I actually have just posted on Twitter. I tweet or X, I don't know, Twix, whatever. I under the title at We the Brandon.
Okay.
And I also use that handle for an account on Getter and Truth Social, but honestly, I never use those. I never use that. It's really only Twitter these days. And my new book, A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine, is basically, it's been described negative. It's been described by my enemies as a revisionist history, whatever. It is basically walking us back to the end of the Cold War and showing the reader how the United States, in a bout of hubris, basically turned a post-Soviet Russia into an enemy when it wanted to be a friend. And one of the key drivers for turning this country into an enemy was because NATO was obsessed with specifically expanding by getting Ukraine. And I talk about the color revolutions, and I talk about, basically I have a lot of contacts in the US kind of intelligence community who talk to me on background. And so I use a lot about what they talked about with me in terms of their experiences over the last 30 years, working in Ukraine, working with, against Russia, and basically how the United States is really the key driver of the conflict right now with Ukraine. And it's not about democracy and human rights. It's about geostrategy. I talk about how there are 4 warm water ports in Russia. Only one of them is actually in Russia proper. That's Vladivostok. But Russia also has the Baltic Sea holdings in the Kaliningrad. They also have the Black Sea holding in Crimea, and they have the Syrian facility, the Eastern Mediterranean in Tartus in Syria. And, I basically trace how what we're experiencing is classic geopolitics. The United States thought, hey, we can push the Russians back even farther and neutralize them as a threat entirely by just rolling back their holding in at least 2 out of 4 of those warm water ports. So you saw the civil war in Syria. Why did Russia get involved? In Syria was partly because they knew that the Obama administration was trying to move Russian naval power out of the Eastern Med. Why is Russia so hot and heavy about Crimea? Well, because in 2010, the Obama administration tried to force the Ukrainian government to cut their ties with Russia over their base at Sevastopol, which they were leasing from Ukraine, which would have meant that Russia would have no status in the Black Sea, and the Russians were never going to allow for that. And so from Putin's perspective, this is not about human rights and democracy. This is cold, hard geopolitics, and the Americans are playing hard, and they're playing dumb too.
Thanks a lot, Brandon. I've enjoyed having you on, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
And we'll catch up again.
I hope I answered your questions. I know I kind of went all over the place, but
you did, man. We got a ton of stuff there. I really appreciate it.